October 1945. The transport ship moved slowly through the fog-shrouded waters of New York Harbor, carrying 73 Japanese prisoners toward American soil. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood at the railing, his eyes scanning the shoreline through the mist. He had fought in the Solomon Islands campaign, commanded a destroyer escort through the Philippine Sea, and survived the systematic dismantling of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He knew what defeat looked like. What he did not know was that everything he believed about the enemy, about their industrial capacity, their society, their very way of life, was about to be systematically dismantled as thoroughly as his nation's military forces had been. The prisoners believed they understood the situation. They had been told by their officers throughout the conflict that American claims of industrial superiority were exaggerations designed to demoralize Japanese forces. The photographs shown to them during the journey, images of massive factories, endless highways, towering buildings, were obviously fabricated propaganda. After all, how could a nation of soft, individualistic people possibly outproduce the disciplined, unified Japanese empire? Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 6 weeks, these men would be confronted with a reality so overwhelming, so completely contrary to everything they had been taught, that some would refuse to believe their own eyes. And the method the Americans chose to demonstrate this reality would prove more psychologically devastating than any battlefield defeat. The fog lifted as the ship entered the harbor, and Yamamoto saw the Statue of Liberty emerge from the mist. It was real. The photographs had not lied about that, at least. But he told himself it was merely one monument, surely the only impressive thing the Americans had to show. The transport docked at a military facility in Brooklyn, and the prisoners were processed with an efficiency that surprised them. No brutality, no theatrical displays of victory, just systematic documentation and medical examinations. They were given clean uniforms, fed a meal that contained more meat than most had seen in months, and housed in barracks that were heated against the October chill. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, a veteran of the carrier forces who had witnessed the Battle of Midway, found himself sharing a barracks with 20 other officers. That first evening, they spoke in hushed tones about their situation. Tanaka had been educated at the Imperial Naval Academy, had studied American capabilities through intelligence reports, and had developed what he considered a realistic assessment of enemy strength. The Americans had numbers, yes, but numbers meant nothing without the warrior spirit that defined Japanese forces. The next morning they were told they would be taken on a tour of New York City. The announcement was met with confusion and suspicion. Why would the Americans show prisoners their largest city? What trap was being prepared? Warrant Officer Kenji Sato, a fighter pilot who had flown missions over China and the Pacific, whispered to his companions that it was obviously a staged performance. They would be shown selected areas, carefully prepared facades designed to impress. It was the same tactic he had heard the Soviets used, present a false image to demoralize the defeated. They were loaded onto buses, comfortable vehicles with padded seats, not the military trucks they expected. The buses had large windows, and the Americans made no attempt to cover them or restrict their view. As they drove through Brooklyn toward Manhattan, the prisoners pressed against the glass, their faces revealing the first cracks in their certainty. The streets were filled with automobiles, not a few military vehicles or staff cars, but thousands of private automobiles, more cars than Yamamoto had seen in his entire life in Japan. They stretched in every direction, a river of metal flowing through intersections, parking along every curb, filling massive lots beside buildings. The buses stopped at a traffic light, and Yamamoto counted. In the time it took for the light to change, perhaps 60 seconds, he counted over 100 automobiles passing through the intersection. One intersection. In 1 minute, Lieutenant Saburo Ishida, an artillery officer who had fought in Burma, pointed at the cars with a trembling hand. "They are all the same model," he said. "Look, the same type over and over. It is a display. They have gathered all the automobiles from across the region to create an impression of abundance." But even as Ishida spoke, Yamamoto noted the variations. Different colors, different manufacturers, different years of production. The traffic extended as far as he could see in every direction. How many vehicles would be required to maintain such a display along their entire route? Thousands? Tens of thousands? The arithmetic of deception began to seem more impossible than the possibility that what they were seeing was simply real. The buses continued into Manhattan, and the prisoners fell silent. The buildings rose around them like cliffs of stone and steel, structures so tall that Yamamoto had to crane his neck to see their tops. 10 stories, 20 stories, 30 stories and higher. Not one such building, but dozens of them, hundreds of them, an entire forest of towers reaching toward the sky. The photographs had not lied, but photographs could not convey the visceral reality of being surrounded by such immensity. They passed construction sites where new buildings were rising, skeletal frameworks of steel climbing toward the clouds. American workers moved with casual efficiency, operating cranes that lifted massive beams as though they were lifting nothing more substantial than bamboo. No one seemed impressed by the scale of the construction. It was ordinary work, unremarkable Tuesday morning labor. The buses stopped in front of the Empire State Building. The prisoners were informed they would be taken to the observation deck. As they filed out of the buses and looked up at the tower, several of the men stopped walking entirely. The building seemed to lean over them, its limestone facade rising 102 stories into the October sky. Yamamoto had seen the photographs. He had dismissed them as obvious fabrications, composite images created by American propagandists. No structure could possibly be so tall. The engineering challenges alone would be insurmountable. "It is a facade," Captain Tanaka announced with authority as they entered the lobby. "A false front erected for our visit. Notice how they rush us through. They do not want us to examine it too closely and discover the deception." But they were not rushed. The Americans seemed content to let them linger in the Art Deco lobby with its marble walls and elaborate metalwork. Yamamoto ran his hand along the wall. Solid stone. The weight of it, the quality of the craftsmanship, the sheer expense represented by the materials, all of it real. They were ushered toward the elevators, and here again several prisoners balked. Warrant Officer Sato refused to enter, convinced that the supposed elevator was actually some form of American trap. An American officer, a major who spoke functional Japanese, addressed their concerns with patient good humor. "The building is real," he said. "The elevator is real. You will see the city from above, and then you will understand why the conflict ended as it did. But no one will be forced. Those who do not wish to ascend may wait in the lobby." His tone was not mocking. There was almost a note of sympathy in his voice, the way one might speak to children being prepared for an uncomfortable but necessary truth. That tone disturbed Yamamoto more than anger would have. It suggested the American already knew what they would experience, knew how it would affect them, and felt something approaching compassion for what they were about to endure. Yamamoto entered the elevator. He had not fought for 4 years only to be defeated by his own fear in an American building. The doors closed, and the elevator began to rise. The sensation was smooth, mechanical, utterly unlike the lurching cargo lifts he had experienced on ships. Floor indicators lit up in sequence, 10, 20, 30, 40. The numbers kept climbing. At floor 60, Lieutenant Ishida made a sound in his throat, a suppressed cry of disbelief. They were already higher than any building in Tokyo, and they were not yet halfway to their destination. The elevator stopped at floor 86. The doors opened onto an observation deck enclosed in glass and steel. The prisoners stepped out slowly, hesitantly, drawn forward by a horrible fascination. Yamamoto walked to the window and looked out over Manhattan Island. The city spread below him like a living map, vast beyond comprehension. Buildings stretched to every horizon, 10,000 structures packed together with geometric precision. Rivers of traffic flowed through the street grid, tiny from this height, but clearly visible, clearly real. He could see ships in the harbor, aircraft crossing the sky, trains running on elevated tracks, and in every direction, more construction, more buildings rising, more evidence of expansion and growth. Captain Tanaka stood beside him, and Yamamoto heard the other officers' breathing accelerate. "How many workers would be required to build all of this?" Tanaka whispered. "How many tons of steel? How much concrete? How many years of labor?" The American major who had accompanied them heard the question and answered it. "Manhattan has approximately 7,000 tall buildings," he said in his accented Japanese. "This particular building required 7 million man-hours to construct. It was completed in 1 year and 45 days. That was 15 years ago. We have built hundreds of similar structures since then." Yamamoto did the arithmetic. 7 million man-hours. One building. Completed in less than 2 years, and that was 15 years ago, before the war, before the industrial expansion that the conflict had triggered. He thought of the aircraft carriers Japan had built during the war, massive undertakings that required years of labor, consumed precious resources, and represented the maximum effort of the nation's industrial capacity. How many carriers could be built with 7 million man-hours? How much steel had gone into this one building? Steel that in Japan would have been carefully rationed, fought over by competing military departments, considered a strategic resource too precious to waste on civilian construction? Lieutenant Ishida was at another window, staring downtown toward the financial district. "I count 40 buildings from here that are taller than anything in Japan," he said. His voice had lost all inflection, becoming flat and mechanical. 40 buildings, from one window. There must be hundreds in the city. The American major nodded. "New York has approximately 500 buildings over 12 stories tall, but this is only one city. America has dozens of major cities with similar construction. Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia. Each has hundreds of tall buildings, thousands of factories, millions of automobiles." He delivered this information without pride or boasting, simply stating facts that he assumed his audience needed to understand. That assumption, that they had not known, that they needed to be educated about basic reality, was perhaps more devastating than the facts themselves. It suggested that the Japanese Empire had gone to war with a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy they faced, that their leaders had made decisions based on information so flawed as to be meaningless. Warrant Officer Sato, the fighter pilot, turned away from the window and addressed the American major directly. "This is impossible," he said. "One nation cannot possess such resources. The mathematics do not work. If America had this level of industrial capacity, Japan would have lost the war in months, not years." The major's expression softened with something approaching pity. "Sir," he said quietly, "I must inform you that America was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. What you experienced in the Pacific represented approximately 30% of our total industrial output. The majority of our production went to Europe, to supporting our allies, to building the infrastructure necessary to project force across 2 oceans simultaneously. The prisoners absorbed this information in silence. 30%. The relentless submarine campaign that had strangled Japanese shipping. 30% of American capacity. The aircraft that had filled the skies over every battlefield, the ships that had appeared in such numbers that they could absorb terrible losses and continue operating without pause. The supplies that had sustained island garrisons through months of siege. All of it, 30%. Yamamoto found himself calculating. If this was 30%, what had the remaining 70% produced? He thought of the intelligence reports he had seen during the war, estimates of American production that his superiors had dismissed as impossible exaggerations. Build 100 aircraft carriers. Absurd. Produce 50,000 aircraft per year. A fantasy designed to damage Japanese morale. Launch a ship every day from a single shipyard. Propaganda that no educated officer would credit. But he was standing in a building 102 stories tall, a building constructed for civilian purposes 15 years before the war began. And below him stretched a city that must have required more steel than Japan had produced in a decade. The mathematics did begin to work, but only if he accepted that everything he had been told about American capacity was not an exaggeration, but an underestimate. They remained on the observation deck for an hour. The American major answered questions patiently, providing statistics that seemed designed to overwhelm rather than enlighten. New York consumed 11 million tons of coal per year to heat its buildings. The city's electrical grid generated 6 billion kilowatt-hours annually. The subway system transported 2 billion passengers per year. Each number was incomprehensible individually, meaningless in isolation, but together they began to paint a picture of an industrial civilization operating on a scale that Japan had never approached. Captain Tanaka had stopped arguing that the display was fabricated. Instead, he had begun asking technical questions about construction techniques, manufacturing processes, resource allocation. How was it possible to produce so much steel? Where did the coal come from? How were the workers trained? The American major answered each question, and with each answer, Tanaka's expression grew more disturbed. There was no secret, no trick, no hidden weakness to exploit. The Americans simply had more of everything: more coal, more oil, more iron ore, more industrial capacity, more trained workers, more capital to invest. And they had possessed these advantages long before the war began. When they finally descended from the observation deck and returned to the buses, the prisoners were silent. The ride back to the detention facility took them through different neighborhoods, past factories and warehouses, through residential districts filled with private homes, each with an automobile parked in front. The accumulation of evidence became crushing. This was not a display. This was Tuesday afternoon in America. Ordinary, unremarkable. The baseline reality of a civilization that produced abundance as casually as Japan produced rice. That evening in the barracks, Yamamoto lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Around him, other officers conducted quiet conversations, trying to process what they had witnessed. Some still clung to the possibility of deception, constructing elaborate theories about how the Americans had staged the entire display. But their arguments sounded hollow even to themselves. The scale of the deception required would be as impressive as the genuine industrial capacity they refused to acknowledge. Lieutenant Ishida sat at a table writing a letter to his family. Yamamoto knew the letter would never be sent. They were prisoners, their correspondence carefully screened, but Ishida wrote anyway, perhaps needing to articulate his thoughts to make them real. After an hour of writing, Ishida put down his pen and spoke to the room at large. "I fought in Burma," he said quietly. "We were told that if we held our positions with sufficient determination, the Americans would eventually lose heart and negotiate a peace. We were told that their spirit was weak, that they valued individual lives too much to sustain heavy casualties. But now I understand that the calculus was never about spirit or determination. They could afford to value individual lives because they had so many men, so much equipment, so much productive capacity that they could replace losses without strain. We fought with the desperation of poverty, while they fought with the confidence of overwhelming wealth." No one responded to Ishida's words, but no one contradicted them either. The observation hung in the air, undeniable and terrible in its implications. Every battle they had fought, every sacrifice their comrades had made, every tactical victory they had achieved, all of it meaningless in the face of an industrial disparity so vast that courage became irrelevant. Over the following weeks, the prisoners were taken to other sites. They visited a Ford automobile factory in New Jersey, where they watched workers assemble cars with machine-like efficiency, one vehicle rolling off the production line every 60 seconds. They toured a steel mill in Pennsylvania, where furnaces the size of buildings converted iron ore into structural steel, at rates that Yamamoto calculated could supply Japan's entire annual steel production in a matter of weeks. They were shown a hydroelectric dam that generated more electricity than all of Japan's power plants combined. At each site, they asked questions, and the Americans answered with patient thoroughness. The message was always the same: this is normal, this is how we live, this is what we built before the war began, and we built even more during the conflict while simultaneously fighting on two fronts. The education was not meant to be cruel. The Americans seemed to genuinely believe that understanding would be helpful, that seeing the reality of their industrial capacity would provide context for the defeat that Japan had suffered. But for many of the prisoners, the effect was psychological devastation, more profound than anything they had experienced in combat. On the battlefield, defeat could be attributed to tactics, to leadership, to the fortunes of war. But this systematic demonstration of industrial superiority removed all such explanations. Japan had lost not because of mistakes or bad luck, but because they had challenged an opponent operating in a completely different category of civilization. It was as though a merchant sailing vessel had challenged a modern battleship, as though a medieval army had confronted machine guns and artillery. Warrant Officer Sato, who had initially refused to board the elevator in the Empire State Building, became increasingly agitated as the tours continued. After visiting the automobile factory, he approached the American major and made a desperate argument. "You must be showing us only your best facilities," Sato insisted. "Surely not every factory operates at such efficiency. Surely there are regions of poverty, areas where the abundance we have witnessed does not reach." The major considered the question seriously before answering. "There are certainly poorer regions," he acknowledged. "Rural areas, mining communities, some urban neighborhoods. But what you must understand is that even our poorest citizens have access to resources that would seem abundant by many standards. The automobile you saw being produced every 60 seconds. Most American families own at least one. The electricity generated by that dam? It powers homes across several states. The steel from that mill. We produce so much that we export it to our allies." Sato received this information with visible distress. He had been trying to find evidence of weakness, some indication that the displays were not representative of typical American capacity. Instead, he received confirmation that what they had witnessed was not the peak of American achievement, but rather its baseline normal. Not all the prisoners reacted with distress. Some, particularly the younger officers who had been conscripted late in the war, seemed almost relieved. For them, the demonstration of American industrial power provided an explanation for their defeat that removed any burden of personal failure. They had not lost because they lacked courage or skill. They had lost because they had been asked to perform an impossible task, to overcome disparities that no amount of warrior spirit could bridge. Captain Tanaka developed a different response. As the tours continued, he began asking increasingly sophisticated questions about American manufacturing techniques, organizational systems, and engineering principles. He took notes in a small journal, sketching diagrams and recording specifications. When Yamamoto asked him about this behavior, Tanaka responded with quiet intensity. "If Japan is to survive as a nation," Tanaka said, "we must learn from this. We must understand not just that America possesses industrial superiority, but how they achieved it. The principles, the systems, the education of their workers, all of this can be studied and eventually replicated. The war is over. Our task now is to ensure that our children do not face the same disadvantages we faced." It was a pragmatic response, almost cold in its rejection of self-pity or recrimination. Tanaka had accepted defeat and immediately begun thinking about how to prevent future defeats. His approach was characteristic of the more senior officers, men who had enough experience to understand that dwelling on the past served no purpose. The war was over. Japan would either learn from the experience or face eventual irrelevance. On their final day in New York, before being transported to a more permanent detention facility, the prisoners were taken to a department store in Manhattan. This tour had not been announced in advance, and its purpose was unclear until they entered the building. The store occupied 6 floors and sold everything from clothing to furniture to household appliances. The Americans made no explanations, simply allowed the prisoners to walk through the aisles, observing the merchandise and the shoppers who moved among the displays with casual familiarity. The abundance was staggering. Racks of clothing in every size and color, shelves stocked with goods that in Japan would have been considered luxury items, electric refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, radios. The food section contained varieties of produce, meat, and processed foods that most of the prisoners had never seen. And the shoppers treated all of this as ordinary, selecting items with the careful consideration of people deciding between equivalent options, not with the desperate gratitude of people accessing scarce resources. Yamamoto watched an American woman examining vacuum cleaners. She compared 3 different models, considered their features, checked the price tags, and finally selected one. She paid for it with cash from her purse, and a store worker loaded the boxed machine onto a cart. The entire transaction took perhaps 10 minutes. The woman was purchasing a complex electrical appliance the way one might purchase vegetables at a market. No special authorization required, no ration coupons, no waiting list, just a simple commercial transaction. Lieutenant Ishida stood beside Yamamoto, watching the same interaction. "In Tokyo," Ishida said quietly, "such a machine would be available only to the wealthy, perhaps only to government officials. It would require months of saving, special permissions, connections to suppliers, and this woman just buys one, as though it were nothing. They wandered through the store for over an hour, observing not just the merchandise but the behavior of the shoppers. People moved with unhurried confidence, their body language suggesting comfort and security. Children ran between the aisles while their parents shopped. Elderly couples examined furniture together, discussing options without apparent financial stress. Young men and women browsed through clothing, making selections based on preference rather than necessity. The contrast with wartime Japan could not have been more stark. While Japanese civilians had endured years of rationing, while cities had been systematically destroyed, while every resource had been devoted to military production, American civilians had continued shopping for vacuum cleaners and discussing which model offered better features. The war that had consumed Japanese society had apparently been a peripheral concern in American daily life. When they returned to the detention facility that evening, the prisoners found themselves facing a difficult psychological transition. They had been defeated in combat. That was a comprehensible reality that soldiers could accept. But they had also been confronted with evidence that the entire premise of their war effort had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy they faced. The Japanese Empire had mobilized its complete industrial capacity, had demanded total sacrifice from its civilian population, had pushed its economy to the breaking point, and had still been overwhelmingly outproduced by an American economy that had barely strained under the burden of simultaneous wars on two continents. Over the weeks and months that followed, as the prisoners gradually received news from Japan and learned of the true extent of their nation's destruction, many would struggle to reconcile their wartime beliefs with the reality they had witnessed. Some would cling to ideological certainty, insisting that spiritual strength mattered more than material abundance. Others would undergo profound transformations, rejecting the militaristic ideology that had led Japan into a war it could never win. But all of them would remember that October morning when they stood on the 86th floor of the Empire State Building and saw stretched below them the casual industrial abundance of a civilization they had been taught to dismiss as soft and decadent. They would remember counting the buildings, calculating the resources, doing the arithmetic that their leaders had apparently never done. And they would remember the moment when the numbers finally made sense, when the scale of their defeat became comprehensible, when they understood that courage and determination had never been enough, because the contest had never been even remotely equal. Yamamoto would later write in his diary, in entries that would be published decades after the war, "We believed we were fighting an enemy who valued comfort over honor, who would retreat when confronted with the warrior spirit of Japan. We were wrong. We were fighting an enemy so wealthy that they could afford both comfort and overwhelming military power, so industrially advanced that they could wage total war while their civilians continued to purchase vacuum cleaners." The photographs of the Empire State Building that we dismissed as propaganda, we should have believed them. We should have done the mathematics. We should have understood what it meant that America could build such a structure before the war began, as a commercial venture without government funding, simply because they had the resources and the ambition. That building, that single tower of steel and stone, should have told us everything we needed to know about the enemy we were challenging. But we did not want to see it, so we did not. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became an industrial power in its own right, many Japanese leaders would cite the experience of the prisoners who were shown the Empire State Building as a transformative moment in their nation's understanding of modern industrial civilization. The lesson was not about military tactics or battlefield strategy. It was about the fundamental importance of industrial capacity, technological advancement, and economic development. Japan would never again make the mistake of believing that spirit alone could overcome material disadvantages. The American officers who conducted these tours understood what they were doing. They were not merely demonstrating their victory or humiliating defeated enemies. They were providing an education in industrial reality, showing prisoners who would eventually return to Japan what true industrial capacity looked like. In doing so, they were investing in Japan's future transformation. The men who saw the Empire State Building, who toured the automobile factories, who witnessed the casual abundance of American department stores, These men would return home with a new understanding of what was possible, of what Japan needed to become if it was to survive and prosper in the modern world. And many of them would dedicate their post-war lives to building that new Japan, applying the lessons they learned during those weeks in America when they were forced to confront the reality their wartime propaganda had obscured. The Empire State Building became a symbol not of American triumph, but of the importance of industrial development. The vacuum cleaners in the department store became a reminder that true national strength came not from military sacrifice, but from economic prosperity that benefited all citizens. The psychological impact of this education was profound and lasting. For the rest of their lives, the men who stood on that observation deck would remember the feeling of looking out over Manhattan and truly understanding for the first time, the scale of the resources they had challenged. And they would remember their own disbelief, their initial conviction, that what they were seeing must be propaganda or deception, because the alternative was too disturbing to accept. That their leaders had led them into a war against an opponent operating on a completely different scale of industrial civilization. The Empire State Building stands today much as it did in October 1945. It is no longer the world's tallest building. That distinction has passed to structures in other nations, including in Asia. But for a generation of Japanese officers who witnessed it in the aftermath of their defeat, it remained the most important building they ever saw, not because of its height or its architectural achievement, but because of what it represented, a casual demonstration of industrial capacity so vast that it had seemed impossible, so overwhelming that it had initially appeared to be propaganda. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.